Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheimer. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing two leaders from Weave in Sacramento, which works on domestic violence. October is Domestic Violence Action Month. So let's really go through the causes and drivers of domestic violence, which affects everyone. Beth Hassett is the CEO and Executive Director of Weave. Allison Kephart is the Chief Operating Officer. Let's talk a little bit about the drivers of domestic violence, because it really does affect everyone. And let's face it, in any viewer's circle of this program, you are likely to have somebody who has experienced domestic violence in your family or your extended friends circle. That's a true statement, isn't it, Beth?
Absolutely. And I think people get a little bit confused about what domestic violence might look like. We get really fixated on that physical violence. So, somebody being punched or physically injured. And we recognize 6 different types of domestic violence. And sometimes people are really dismissive of what's going on in their relationship because there isn't that physical element. But we talk about emotional abuse, which almost every victim is likely to experience, and also spiritual abuse, not being allowed to participate in things that fill you up, or using religion or some kind of dogma against a person. There's technological abuse, which we're seeing more and more of as technology gets more complicated, using devices or social media, for instance, to abuse somebody. Sexual abuse within a relationship is also another type of domestic violence, and financial abuse. So many of the people we serve either have ruined credit, or their identity was stolen, or they are forced to work and give their money away, or they're not allowed to work. So I think it's really important for people to understand that it might look a lot of different ways, and the person that you're talking to or assessing for, what's going on in your relationship, it could look very different than what I think people think domestic violence looks like.
Allison, I'd like to talk a little bit about this idea of the definition, because the traditional definition, as Beth said, is very much focused on physical abuse and the physical signs of that abuse. But here we're talking about a definition that is evolved to include things like financial abuse. So let's focus just on financial abuse. Talk a little bit about how financial abuse actually falls into the category of abuse, of taking away power, of disempowering the other person, right? And how that affects you for a really long period of time. Just let's focus on the file for a bit.
Yeah, I think you touched on it exactly on point, which is this is all about, when we talk about abuse, we talk about power and control, and controlling somebody's access to resources is a critical component of that, whether they have access to purchase food for their family, to put gas in their car, to go to get services or support, controlling their finances, as Beth mentioned, maybe forcing someone to work and turn over their paychecks, or refusing to allow them to work. If you think about what the long-term impacts of that are for someone in their ability to leave an abusive relationship, if they have not had an opportunity to build a resume, time in a workforce, and then they try to leave a relationship, their ability to then get a job later and secure their economic future is much more limited. They're probably going to be limited to job opportunities that produce sort of the lowest wages that are available, right? And if we talk about the more insidious and longer range versions of economic abuse, like identity theft or coerced debt, where somebody's leaving a relationship with tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, that can take years and years to try to overcome, particularly if the debt is something that they're not able to set aside through traditional mechanisms like a bankruptcy proceeding, which has its own, long-term impacts. So, I mean, these are things that survivors are going to carry with them and they're going to battle against for many years. They're going to impact their ability to rent an apartment, to purchase a vehicle, to, do any of the things that many people do to keep themselves safe and stable. So it has a very long-term effect.
And Beth, let's talk about another aspect of abuse that you mentioned. You talked about technological abuse, right? Again, you're not seeing a bruise on somebody's face, right? You're not seeing a broken arm. But that abuse can follow you around to no end. It can affect all sorts of different elements of your life. Talk a little bit about that, because the theme seems to be imposition of will through coercive means.
Absolutely. I mean, we take social media that is such a big part of many people's lives. We have folks who are being stalked through their social media. They've left their partner and they're continuing to be stalked on social media, or somebody's creating a false account and posting AI images of them in compromised positions, threatening to show them to their employer if they don't cooperate with them. Also, just straight on stalking, everything from Find My iPhone being turned on so that they're tracking somebody where they're going, or air tags in your car. When people come into our confidential shelter, we have to be really careful to make sure that they weren't stalked coming to our shelter. So, there's so many ways to control, manipulate, and track somebody that, every day they come up with something new.
And the common theme is coercion, right? The coercion and power and disempowerment. It could be physical, it could be emotional, it could be technological, it could be financial. If you are actually removing power and removing agency from somebody and imposing your will on that person, that is you're infantilizing them, right? Mm-hmm. That is the abuse that you're talking about. That is the common theme, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And I think a lot of people get confused because, we definitely see couples that just fight all the time, for instance. They're just co-combative. They, don't get along. But the question is one person in this relationship afraid of the other person? Is one person under the control of another person? Is there a pattern of behavior where somebody is constantly being put down and controlled? And that's what domestic violence looks like. It's not just a grumpy couple.
So it's fear. It's the actual fear, right, Allison?
Yes, absolutely. As Beth said, is one person really controlling the environment? Is one person, driving that dynamic and saying, you can't do this, you can't go here, you must do this, you must go here, you're not allowed to talk to that person, those kinds of things. And that is very different than what we would otherwise describe as maybe an unhealthy relationship or a co-combative relationship where folks are grumpy or angry with each other or arguing. That has its own set of issues, certainly, but that's not going to rise to the level of an abusive relationship where folks are really have that imbalance of power that you were describing earlier, where one person is really imposing their will, is really, exercising that power and control over the other, and driving the environment and the circumstances.
Now, in the traditionalist sense, the power imbalance is very often fallen along gender lines. Men functioning as the abusers and women functioning as the victims. And that might be still preponderantly true, but it's not always the case. The abuse can go in either direction, right? In terms of any kind of partnership or marriage or whatever. There are same-sex couples, which means that it doesn't fall along gender lines anymore. And there are other types of arrangements in today's society that it reveals that abuse can go in any particular direction. Beth, could you talk a little bit about how that means that you respond a little bit differently and you shape your service a little bit differently for abuse that is still abuse, but it does not fall along traditionalist lines? That cause services to be built in particular ways. Sometimes you have to break your own norms in order to serve those people who are suffering abuse who don't fall along those traditionalist lines.
Absolutely. And it goes all the way back to the 70s when a lot of agencies like Weave were formed, and they were very gendered. I mean, it was very much women leaving men and men being the abusers. And fast forward to about 15 years ago, when we really started reframing our brand as a nonprofit. We were seen very much as a women's organization, and it was a big barrier for people that you've just described to get help. And since we've really pushed out there that we're here for all genders, all identities, all people, all the time, we've seen a huge increase in the number of men who seek services and non-binary folks, same-sex couples, all of these people, some of whom are even more at risk. You look at the trans community, they're very at risk for violence. So one of the first things we had to do was determine that we weren't going to look at gender when bringing people into our confidential shelter. We were going to bring men in, we were going to bring transgender folks. That really wasn't going to be a factor in determining whether somebody could get services. Same with our group counseling. A man can be in a group counseling session if he's comfortable. So it started with that kind of messaging and just, how are we going to invite people in a welcoming way? One of the challenges with same-sex couples is, to some extent, it depends on who gets to us first. There often isn't an obvious aggressor if you're just looking at the people standing in front of you. But as we've been discussing, that power and control and who's really in charge and who's dominating somebody comes out pretty quickly. But once we've served one person, we don't serve the other person in the couple, regardless of what gender they are. But we do find a lot of men coming to us, and sometimes people get confused. They're like, well, how can a man be afraid? But, there are a lot of dynamics that can be that power and control dynamic. We'll have, where the woman has mental health issues, and the man is very afraid for the children, and very afraid that he won't have custody of these kids, that kind of a thing. And women can be physically violent as well. They can also impose financial abuse and all of the other types of abuse that we've been talking about.
So as you shape the organization, you've adjusted over the years. Talk a little bit about how you work with counterparts in the community, because you did say that you can't represent both sides. Right. So you have to rely on counterparts that are also interacting with these individuals. And it's a little bit different than you would find in a business environment where there is so much competition for resource that people tend not to be as cooperative. But you actually have to cooperate with counterparts in the community, including law enforcement, including other partner nonprofits, government agencies, civil society organizations, churches, and so on. Could you both talk a little bit about how that actually functions and how that is built into the fabric of the work that you do?
We can't do this work alone. It takes a whole community to protect survivors of domestic violence. And we have very close relationships with partner organizations. And in fact, one of the keys to our success has been an embedded model of advocacy where we actually have co-located staff members in other community organizations. Specifically, we have partnerships with 5 of the law enforcement agencies in our community and have an advocate who's embedded there and actually following up after there's a domestic violence or sexual assault call by law enforcement. We're in churches and faith-based organizations, and also embedded in the community in organizations that are providing other supportive services to a particular community. We have some partnerships with the Black African American community, for instance, where we're building trust in that community so that they will refer people for help, because there are a lot of barriers to engaging in the criminal legal system, admitting you have mental health issues, admitting there's something wrong in your family. And so we have to go out and build trust with these other groups so that they'll say, hey, it's okay to go to Weave. It's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to get help.
Yeah, I would absolutely echo that. And I think the other critical component too is, as Beth noted, we can't do it alone, in part because we are only one piece of the puzzle. All of these different organizations in the community that you just mentioned, Mark, all have different roles to play. Law enforcement has a particular role to play. We have a particular role to play. The faith-based organizations have a role to play, and they're all a piece to the puzzle. And if we don't work together, that's where we end up with survivors who get missed, fall through the cracks, don't get all the wraparound support that they really need and deserve. And so if we just all operate in our own little silos and our own little rowboats, then it ends up putting all of the onus on the survivors to be able to move from one individual discrete thing to another, instead of us working together to help build that safety net and keep them protected and afloat.
How do you deal with cultural competencies? You mentioned a number of different ethnic groups. If I'm African American, I'm not Hmong, right? If I'm Japanese American or a immigrant from someplace, I have a particular identity. I have a particular cultural context. If I'm Chinese or Filipino or white European or wealthy or lack resources, right? There's a cultural context. We can't be everything to everyone.
We can't be everything to all people, but we can work really hard to understand them and provide services that will resonate with folks. Sacramento is one of the most diverse communities in the country. And so we're always having to learn about a new group. When the Afghanis started immigrating here, there was a whole new group we had to learn about. One thing we do is we're very intentional in how we hire, and we work hard to hire people from the communities that we serve.
Is that a superpower? Is having a diverse staff and welcoming new information in? Is that a superpower in this particular area of abuse prevention and addressing domestic violence?
I think having a diverse staff is absolutely a superpower. We have to have people who can speak the languages that look like the people who are coming in, and who have access into some of these communities where they don't really want the nice ladies from Weave coming in and telling them what to do in their communities. And it's really important that we build those relationships and build trust in a variety of communities.
I think it's also very important that we cultivate within our organization a culture of curiosity. As you noted, we can't be experts in all the things, even with a very diverse staff. Each staff member is coming with their own cultural context. And so part of what we need to do is build within our agency a culture of openness and curiosity and welcoming for individuals who are different than us and have different experiences than us, and making it the norm to ask others, how can I help you best? What will meet your needs best? Because you are the expert in what meets your needs the best.
So very true that cultural contexts shift. And so what could be in one culture processed as abuse from a different perspective might not be processed in the same way. But then you also have the generational shifts, right, within communities. How do you deal with those nuance of perceptions amongst generations? People becoming more acclimated to a Americanized sort of way of being versus a traditionalist way of being. You must at times encounter these different perspectives, even within communities, where somebody is processed that they are being abused and the other person is processed that this is normal behavior. How do you deal with that? I mean, there's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. There's just adjudication. Do your processes take that into account, and how do you navigate?
A lot of our addressing the differences in generations and how people view abuse really shows up in some of our prevention and education work. We do a lot of work in the community and communities in just what we're doing here today, talking about what might domestic violence look like. What are the laws that protect victims? Because, when we get people moving in from other cultures, other countries, there are things that are illegal in the United States that aren't illegal in other countries. So we're out in the community a lot trying to reach people of all ages, starting as young as 5-year-olds, to talk about healthy boundaries and consent and healthy relationships up through junior high and high school, and then getting to those parents and grandparents who might be raising these youth who are going to end up being the next victims and perpetrators unless we do something to interrupt that intergenerational cycle of violence.
Talk a little bit about your relationship with the enforcement side, the policing side, because this is so critical to a healthy civil society. We need people who serve and protect. We need people who enforce. We need people who use the coercive power of strength at certain times when society is under threat. Now we have a situation where that coercive power is being used in ways that some feel is being misused. So how do you function within the community where there are these mixed emotions, particularly now, in terms of how the enforcement mechanisms of the state are being used? How do you cultivate relationships that are based in understanding, cooperation, a recognition mutually of the usefulness of the various sides here? How do you do this? Because this has got to be a very complicated series of conversations, right, Allison?
It is. And, I think we've intentionally cultivated these relationships with our law enforcement partners for a long time because of exactly the complexity that you are identifying. That, our law enforcement partners do have a lot of different responsibilities in our community. And for us, our focus is on how can we best serve the survivors that we are here to support, right? The victims and survivors who've experienced domestic and sexual violence. And for us, the best way to do that is to work with those law enforcement partners that are going to encounter those survivors and are going to encounter the perpetrators that have done harm, and helping them understand what the dynamics, just like we're talking about today, what those dynamics look like, so that when a law enforcement officer has responded to the same house for the 6th or 7th or 8th time, they go with the knowledge and the understanding of why they've come to that house for the 6th or 7th or 8th time, rather than going with a perspective of dismissiveness and saying, these people are just fighting, or this is a waste of time, or this victim's never going to leave. Why do I bother? So that's a really important part of our relationship, and balancing and educating those folks in the same way that we work closely with our prosecutor partners, who are the other part of our criminal justice system, are folks who are prosecuting perpetrators who've been arrested and are facing criminal charges for the harm that they've done. And how do we balance what that looks like against maybe what the survivor's wishes are, and maybe they want to see accountability, but they don't necessarily want to see the perpetrator spend the next 20 years in prison because that perpetrator is the father of their children. And so it's a very complex dynamic. And
since we have a large group of people who are illegal in one way or another, or have had law enforcement entanglements, right? Almost any act that you have can create downstream disruption that is feared by the family members. Plus, you have the emotional entanglements, because very often abuse one day is forgiven the next, right? And that can be very frustrating for law enforcement. Beth, has this changed dynamic in terms of what is going on with immigrant communities and so on? Has that affected your work?
We're really seeing some changes in immigrant communities being willing to step up and get help. There's real fear of accessing services. Is ICE going to be there? Do I have to prove whether I'm documented or not? There's definitely fear, especially here in California, down in the border counties. We're hearing that survivors aren't calling, they aren't asking for help in the same way that they used to. And we're definitely seeing it within our own organization as well.
And that causes damage to civil society. I mean, it's just generalized damage to ourselves when that kind of fear prevents the address of domestic violence, right? Because that promulgates. I want to get to your services, and then we're going to close off the discussion. But I want to cite some statistics that are just always astounding when I read them. 1 in 3 women experience domestic violence. 1 in 3 women. 1 in 3 women. If you know 3 women, one of them is likely to have experienced domestic violence. That is just, to me, always astounding. 15% of domestic violence victims are men. Huge, huge fact. And this is really important. Teens, 16 to 19, are most likely to be assaulted. Assaulted. If you know a teen, you have to really be cognizant of the fact that the people who you know, there is somebody who you don't know has been assaulted. There is somebody who you don't know has been abused. There's somebody you don't know that they've been abused. That's the thing that really is astounding, isn't it?
People don't realize what's going on in other people's lives, and they don't always see the signs. And when people are in an abusive relationship young, and let's be clear, what feels like love to a 14-year-old can look really abusive to somebody from the outside. Oh, he follows me around all the time and tells me he wants to be with me constantly and tells me what to wear. Well, that's not so cute 10 years later. So, we're always trying to educate folks about what the signs are of an abusive relationship. And unfortunately, if somebody doesn't get help, doesn't get some kind of an intervention after an abusive relationship, they're very likely to repeat that and fall into another abusive relationship or a different type of abusive relationship. Maybe there's no physical abuse in this one, but it's, really horrifically emotionally abusive. So having intervention services like Weave provides and other agencies throughout the country are the trick to getting people healthy and healed and to overcome the trauma that they've experienced as an abuse victim.
So, Allison, I'm going to quickly go through some of the services and programs, and please jump in. You have counseling, you have a safe shelter, you have safety planning, you have Weave Legal, Weave on Campus, Weave Spanish, addressing different needs of different communities. You have education for youth. You work in schools. What other parts of your service offerings do you want to highlight?
You touched on those, what we refer to as our core services, our safe shelter if someone's trying to, ready to leave and needs a safe, confidential place to go. If they need help, legal assistance, maybe getting a restraining order or establishing custody orders. If they want to come speak with a counselor to either process what they've experienced or explore whether they are ready to leave their relationship. Not everyone's in a place where they're ready to leave or they are escaping something. They're still sorting out what they're experiencing. So those are really the core pieces. And then, we really lean heavily, particularly during times like this, during Domestic Violence Action Month, into those preventative services, that prevention education work, whether it's going into our K through 12 schools. And as Beth mentioned, talking with our young folks early and often about consent and boundaries and bodily autonomy. And then as our kiddos are getting older, talking about healthy versus unhealthy relationships and what does it look like to engage positively with a partner, with an intimate partner? And what does it look like when that isn't so positive? How do you navigate away from that? How do you ask for help during those times? Those are really important things to be talking about. And it's also really important to be talking with the adults in our community. How do you help? How do you intervene as a bystander if you see this happening to someone that you care about? As you mentioned, we all know folks that are experiencing this. So it's really important to us to help educate the members of the communities that we serve about how to recognize the signs that someone's experiencing abuse, respond appropriately, and then refer them to services through an organization like ours. We don't expect everyone to be the expert in how to be an advocate. We just want them to know how to support the folks they care about and then get them to the services that can help them.
And Beth, what should I do this month? October is Domestic Violence Action Month. So what action should I be taking?
You can always donate money to your favorite domestic violence agency. That's an act of support, but also to educate yourself. We encourage people, go on our website, poke around, look at what the power and control might look like. learn about what somebody might be experiencing, and educate yourself about what to say if somebody discloses to you. We hear time and again from survivors that, they told a coworker or they told someone at their church or their neighbor, and the person said, I believe you, you don't deserve this, and there's help for you. I mean, those are powerful words to somebody who's probably feeling very isolated, has likely been cut off from their friends and family, isn't sure what they're experiencing counts as domestic violence. To have somebody say, this is not normal, this is not right, and you don't deserve this, can be that little spark that leads somebody to exploring what's going on for them, to seeking help, to really believing that they're worthy of a relationship where they don't feel undermined and less than.
Being a family to your family, being a friend to your friends, and being a friend to people who you don't know. Really paying attention to the person. I'd like to thank you, Beth Hassett, CEO and Executive Director of Weave, and Allison Kephart, Chief Operating Officer of Weave. Thank you so much for your work. Please thank your communities. Please thank your staffs, your board members, your funders, and all the people who are part of that extended family, including those people who've experienced domestic violence. They are part of your work. Such an important part of your work, and they become ambassadors for Weave. Thank you so much for your insights. It's just been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very much.